Alright, here we go with the last set of notes on our evolution unit, this one on the patterns of evolution. So we'll talk about some other drivers of evolution and talk about some of the different ways that organisms evolve relative to each other. Before we get too far into the other patterns of evolution, I just want to talk a little bit about some other things that can cause evolution. Obviously, we've been spending a lot of time talking about natural selection. Natural selection is definitely the major cause of evolution, the major cause of populations to change from generation to generation. But remember, these changes are driven by your DNA, right? We talked about descent with modification and changes in the phenotype being passed along in the genotype. So really any change in the genotype of a population can cause evolution. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is something called gene flow. So think of it like flowing of water, flowing of rivers. Genes can flow when organisms enter or leave a population. So as organisms can bring or remove alleles, or the genes, as they enter or leave a population. So if somebody new moves in, then they have a new characteristic, they're bringing some new genes into the gene pool, or they're taking some genes out of the gene pool. So there's basically just migration. The next cause of evolution is something called genetic drift. And this one can be a little bit tricky. It can seem similar to gene flow, but it really isn't. So in genetic drift, this is just random changes in a population's gene pool. So just kind of random shifts between being, for example, like homozygous dominant for a trait versus heterozygous and homozygous recessive. So just small changes. And so two of the most common types of genetic drift are called the bottleneck event and then the founder effect. So a bottleneck event is something like pictured here, where you have a whole population and something happens that really, really limits the size of the population. So for example, these guys, right, not all these marbles can fit through this bottleneck, so that limits it. And so this is the original gene pool with lots and lots of different colors, and you have some event, so maybe like a volcano erupts and kills 90% of the population, and it just so happens that only a couple of these guys survive and they're yellow and blue. Well, when those guys reproduce and create the new population, you're going to end up with a greater proportion of yellow and blue marbles. So kind of the same thing if there are organisms. And then similarly would be the founder effect, where if you have a general population and maybe some percentage, maybe even a small percentage has, for example, some sort of genetic disorder, and then you started a new colony or something like that, and this did happen in some of the colonies in the New World or in like South Africa, and just one of those individuals happens to have this rare genetic condition. Well, it's rare over here, but now in our new colony, it's not that rare, and so as this population increases, you have more of that genetic condition or that genetic trait or whatever it is. So it's causing change in a population, but it's not really due to natural selection. And then finally is everyone's favorite, mutation, where you can actually create new alleles. You can change the genome of an individual, and that produces some sort of new phenotype, which can then provide material for natural selection to work on. Okay, so moving on to patterns of evolution. The first pattern, or the way organisms can evolve, this is called convergent evolution. This is when two or more species become more similar, right? Their lines of evolution converge towards each other. They start out being dissimilar and become more and more similar. A good example of this would be sharks and dolphins. Right? We already talked about whales, dolphins being a type of whale. They started off on land, so obviously they would be way over here on land, sharks coming from sea creatures, and they're fairly similar in shape and appearance. They're becoming more and more similar. Another example, or the next example, would be divergent evolution, and this is the exact opposite of convergent evolution. This is where organisms are becoming less similar. So they start off being similar, and they move apart from each other. So, for example, common dogs, even though these guys are all still the same species, they're obviously, and this is an artificial selection, but they are becoming more and more different and could eventually become a new species. For example, a Shih Tzu is probably going to have a hard time mating with a Great Pyrenees or a Bull Mastiff or something like that. And then finally we have coevolution. This is when two or more species evolve together. For example, bees and flowers evolving together because they need each other. It could be also something like a predator-prey relationship, right, where the fastest prey are the ones that escape, and then the fastest predators are the ones that catch them. So each of them are causing each other to get faster and faster and faster and faster. Or it could be, like I said, more of a cooperative thing, like bees and flowers evolving together. Flowers need bees to transmit their pollen, and bees need the flowers to provide food. They're evolving together. So it's not always a harmony thing, though. It could be predator and prey. So then these patterns of evolution could lead to the evolution of a new species, and this is called speciation, so the creation of a new species. And this obviously would be divergent evolution, when species are becoming less similar and turning into more of a new species. And this is basically caused when populations stop mating with each other. They stop exchanging DNA, and they sort of go off on their own direction and change differently, and eventually they stop mating with each other, so then they're considered a new species. That's sort of the definition of a species. If they can and do mate with each other in the wild, then they would be the same species, but if they don't mate with each other, they would be a different species. And we see examples of that over here, like in this butterfly. Right, it starts out like this, and then this group kind of goes this way, this group kind of goes this way. Right? They're the same at this point, but they're doing their own thing, they're doing their own thing, and now these guys are going to be very, very different. And if this butterfly is looking for more something that looks like it's probably not going to mate with this orange and red butterfly, because it's not going to think that this is an attractive mate. So then they would be considered a new species. And this can happen in a couple different ways. The first could be a physical separation. So for example, there could actually be some sort of mountain range in between these guys, right? So these guys are evolving on one side of the mountain, these guys are evolving on the other side of the mountain, and there's no way for them to get back and forth, so they kind of go off on their own thing and they do something different. The next way you could separate a population could be called behavioral separation. So this is when there's a certain behavior that is different that prevents them from mating. So for example, a mating dance, or the type of nest that they build, if the type of dance that they're doing or the type of nest that they do isn't attractive to each other, right? If this guy is doing a certain kind of fluttering motion to attract the females, and this female is doing or looking for a different type of fluttering, they're not going to mate. Okay, so that can cause some separation. And then finally, the last way of separating is just, they call this a temporal separation, or separation in time. So their mating seasons might differ. So if this guy is looking to mate in June and this lady's looking for a mate in August, they're not going to line up too well, so chances are they are not going to mate. And you can see sort of examples of this when you look at different populations. So here's an example of salamanders in California, and you can sort of imagine how this guy here maybe being the common ancestor, and you can sort of see how these guys on this side of the mountain range are sort of similar to each other, and you can see the characteristics they probably inherited from this guy, and then these guys kind of went their own different way, more similar to each other, has some similarities with a common ancestor, but very, very different from these guys. Probably not going to be mating with each other at all because there's mountains in the way. So an example of speciation there. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about is what doesn't cause speciation. This is something that I see on students' tests all the time, and it kind of drives me crazy a little bit. But one thing that does not cause a new species is mating with another species. It's not like, oh, hey, this beetle's looking for a mate, and oh, I can't find a mate. I guess I'll mate with this bird instead. No, it doesn't work that way, right? Numbers of chromosomes have to line up, has to be more similar. Remember how big a deal it can be if humans end up with just like one extra copy of a chromosome. Could you imagine if you ended up with an entirely different set of chromosomes? It just wouldn't work. So many reasons why two species that are very different just wouldn't mate with each other. Okay? Sometimes this can happen in like a zoo, right? This is a liger. This is a male lion bred with a female tiger. And it could happen, right? This is a real picture, this is a real animal, but these guys are actually sterile, right? This is called a hybrid. They're a mixture, but this guy can't have babies. So it's not really a viable biological solution. So wouldn't be considered a new species because they can't maintain their own line. And then finally, another one, mutations do not cause a new species. Right? We talked about how mutation can cause evolution, yeah, but you're not going to have some random mutation event, something living next to a nuclear power plant and all of a sudden turning into a new animal. That's just really not going to happen. So Two things that do not cause changes in a species. Okay, so with that, we are all done with this set of notes.